Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today, our topic is Russia's security interests in the Arctic, and joining us is the director of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, Rebecca Pincus. Also with us, Mathieu Boulegue is a Polar Institute Global Fellow and a Research Fellow with the Russia and Eurasia Programs at Chatham House. And our third guest is Michael Petersen. Michael is director of the Russia Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College. He previously served at the Defense Intelligence Agency and on the National Security Council. I want to welcome all three of you to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Becca, if I could begin with you, it's no coincidence that these two gentlemen are with you today at the Wilson Center. Tell our viewers about what you have planned for the remainder of the day.
Thanks, John. Yes, Mike and Matt were generous enough to share some time with us this morning ahead of an afternoon program we're putting on titled Deterring Russia at Sea in the High North, which is the first in a series of events the Polar Institute will be featuring in coming months on security and defense issues in the Arctic and High North. And we're really excited to be highlighting some of the defense challenges that the U.S. and its allies face in the region. Obviously, it's timely right now with the one-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine. Everyone's eyes are focused on Russia, and we know that the Arctic and the High North is an incredibly important region to Russia. So we're really excited to be taking a closer look, and we really appreciate these terrific sets of expertise for the event this afternoon, which will also feature senior Navy leaders for what should be a really terrific event. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I should tell our viewers that if you'd like to see those panels that Becca just described, if you come to wilsoncenter.org and you click the programs tab and find the Polar Institute, all of that will be archived there and you'll be able to watch all of it. And I'm sure these are going to be terrific discussions. Let's start with the elephant in the room, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then we can unpack the topic a little more from there. But, you know, everything I've learned from you, Becca, and from your predecessor, Mike Sfraga, and all the experts that you've brought through the Wilson Center over the years is that, relatively speaking, the Arctic has been a model for cooperation more than conflict. Does the Russian invasion of Ukraine change that calculus? And maybe all three of you could weigh in on that, because I know it's not a precise situation, and it's also an ongoing and evolving situation.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important question. I think over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, the U.S. and its allies had been looking for bright spots in the relationship with Russia and looking to build cooperation in the face of, frankly, increasing challenges. And, you know, we can go back to the invasion of Crimea in 2014 or even Georgia in 2008. But obviously, the further and absolutely savage invasion of Ukraine last year has put, I think, what I would describe as the final nail in the coffin in terms of cooperating with Russia in the Arctic. But you know, we have some of the foremost Russia and Arctic experts in the country and perhaps the world with us. So I really want to hear what they say. So, you know, Matt, please give us your take.
The world is a big place. So thanks a lot, Becca. Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's the final nail in the coffin that we should have seen coming, or we ought to have seen coming, because we can't trust, obviously, Kremlin's intentions. Cooperation was always exemplified in the Arctic, as you say, as good gentlemanly relationships, good neighborly relations, always like a sort of working relationship, day-to-day management, military-to-military contact in the Arctic. All of this has been washed away, of course, and it's a literal sea change in terms of cooperation. There is no going back to a form of new normal or status quo ante, not least also because Russia's perceptions have sort of been vindicated by the war. The way, you know, from Moscow's window, the fact that all of the non-Russian Arctic is now NATO territory, which is vindicating the forced posture that, yes, NATO is out there to get us. NATO is out there to try to do something sneaky around us, and therefore trying to validate the Kremlin's perception. And this is where we also have a problem, because we can't tether the Kremlin back to a form of discussion that could be beneficial to coastal states and circumpolar affairs.
And I would think that from Russia's perspective, that Matthew is absolutely right, first of all, that this has kind of sort of vindicated their view, justified or not, that the NATO is out to get them. Now, we know that that's not true, but there's an internal logic there to Russia's thinking, to Moscow's thinking, that in fact they are. And with the increase in tensions as a result of the war, I think that has sort of bled across the globe, and it has bled into all aspects of relationships with Russia around the globe, not just in the Arctic. But the Arctic is a good reflection, I think, of what has happened. And I think that one of the things that the war has shown is that Russia can't be counted on to be a good negotiating partner. They do not negotiate in good faith right now. I'm not sure that they have negotiated in good faith since the initial invasion in 2014. So we have been stuck in this question of cooperation versus competition, this binary sort of difference. Are we going to compete with the Russians in the Arctic? Are we going to cooperate with them there? We don't know. I think that's wrong. I think the right approach to Russia in the Arctic going forward is to manage that relationship. We have to decide what we will and we will not tolerate, and then be very clear about communicating those limits to Moscow itself.
So does the end of cooperation, at least in the foreseeable future, clearly competition is still on the table, but does the end of cooperation automatically move us closer to the potential of conflict?
I'm not so sure that it does. I think that there are very good reasons to be confident that conflict in the Arctic is still a pretty distant prospect. Russia is deeply motivated, I think, to defend its interests, but there are not a whole lot of claims that Russia makes that might, sort of territorial claims that I think rise to the level of conflict. And in any case, the Ukraine war has become this moment that is sucking in all of Russia's, or most of Russia's, sort of military resources. That's not to say that their resources in the high north are suffering in any way, but it is to say that it would be very, very difficult indeed for Russia to conduct a conflict in the Arctic based on the conditions that are on the ground in Ukraine right now.
Matt,
a couple of words on that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I completely agree with what Mike said. The other thing as well is escalation can always be, and can sometimes be, unintended, right? The risk of miscalculation, the risk of tactical errors, the risk of miscommunication because we just don't communicate with the Kremlin in such a way that is meaningful, or even if we do communicate, we don't know if there's a grown-up listening on the other end of the line, or if our message will be heard and understood as deterring, for instance, or not provoking. So it means that miscalculations can happen, and this is the risk that we have now of unintended escalation. And the fact that an accident somewhere in the world could degenerate very well into the Arctic. And that's the risk, right? That I completely agree with what Mike said. There is very little chance that a conflict will erupt in the Arctic or about the Arctic, but some flare-ups elsewhere could actually degenerate into the region, into the high north, most likely. This is called horizontal escalation, right? Also because Russia understands all these lands, all these territories, specifically from the Baltic Sea to the high north, as a continuum. They're not thinking about flanks. They're not thinking like we do with the alliance, with NATO, for instance, in terms of the eastern flank, the Nordic flank, and so on. They think about a stretch of continuum, a strategic continuum, where they see NATO everywhere. And this is also where we have a sort of dissonance in our understanding of what the nature of the threat is.
Matt, what you describe, it's maybe justifiable, but it sounds like a certain amount of paranoia. And I'm wondering how Russia views its security interests in the region beyond that, beyond a general concern about NATO being everywhere.
So paranoia is an interesting but very loaded term, right? Because it generally applies to a person, and you can always, make the argument that a country could have a form of foreign policy outlook there that is paranoid. And sometimes paranoia leads to violence, or the use of violence as a justifiable way to make ends meet, therefore to enact a foreign policy. And this is exactly what the Kremlin has been doing, using force, might, and military power as a tool of foreign policy to prove a point. The question is now whether these perceptions, these foreign policy perceptions, this paranoia that the Kremlin has been feeding itself, is justified or justifiable. Well, in a way, it's a question of the way you view the world. It's a question of your own cognitive biases, the way you understand how you project your foreign policy intentions. And in this, everybody's responsible until they're not. And yes, you can always cherry pick your arguments by saying NATO is responsible, NATO trying to expand its borders. But at the end of the day, the Kremlin foreign policy has been feeding a grievance narrative, has been feeding a sense of encirclement, a besieged fortress narrative that has been sipping through society as well, that has been sipping through 20 years of Putinistic power, over 10 years of great power propaganda fueled by social media and information warfare and information engineering, which is created now a fait accompli that we can see in Ukraine. It's really the tip of the iceberg. Now, the way they're projecting their intentions in the High North specifically and all over the stretch of the Arctic is quite interesting, because it still emanates from the Soviet logic that, you know, NATO is still out there to get them, that the alliance is expanding to try to deter and counter Russian intentions, to deny Russia the sense of greatness or a reappropriation of the Arctic that they've been doing for the past 20 years. So it is vindicating and validating their vision, which is deeply flawed and completely not historically right, and creating this new sense of a new normal, which is antagonism and an adversarial relationship that is not going anywhere.
A former colleague of mine used to always remind me that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you.
Exactly.
Becca, over to you.
I think it's also important to recognize that Russia has very important economic interests in the Arctic region. And so I think that plays into a piece of their security calculations. And that's something that I think you've written about, Mike.
Yes. So I think that the economic interests that Russia has obviously are mostly based in energy. But there are transportation issues as well. There are lots of things wrapped up in Arctic, in Russia's Arctic economic interests in the Arctic. Among those, it's twisted right up with that, are military interests. I don't think that you can separate the two, because where Russia's economic interests are, so goes its military. They've been very clear in their own documents, their own doctrine, their own sort of public statements about what the military is doing in the Arctic, and that is to support its economic interests there. Most recently, Russia published its maritime doctrine back in newest maritime doctrine in 2022. And that doctrine made very clear that Russia's primary economic interests lie in the Arctic, and that they will fight to defend them. They called the Arctic a vital area, and that is a very specific term that they use. And in the doctrine itself, they define that term. They say that the loss of control of this vital area will endanger the state. And anyone who follows Russia policy and Russian military thinking knows that when they use the term endangering the state, that means a signal that they will fight to defend it, even consider nuclear weapons to do so. I'm not saying that they will, but that is a signal that they would consider them if pushed too hard.
We've been looking at this largely from the perspective of Russia. What about flipping the coin? How does NATO view this region, and how does NATO view its relationship with Russia, and how it might go about deterrence? As Matt talked about deterrence and the possibility for that to be misunderstood. What is the strategy from NATO's perspective, the US and its allies?
So the short answer is that NATO doesn't have an Arctic strategy yet, but you know, to expand upon it, it's a sort of new wake-up call for the Atlantic Alliance to discover that there are things happening north of the North Atlantic, that it's not just the link between resupplies between the United States and Europe, mostly the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea region, but that there's a new front or a new flank to defend, to deter the enemy potentially, and also to protect the interests of the alliance and its member countries and allies. The question is now, what is the place and role of NATO moving forward in this region? We know there are discussions going on at the level of the alliance, specifically in the context of Finland and Sweden joining soon, at some point, eventually, the Atlantic Alliance. One of the underpinning questions over there is, should NATO take a bigger role in terms of deterrence, defense, collective defense, namely in the region, but also resilience? What does it mean for the force posture of the enemy? Because the moment you place more NATO, whether it is the alliance itself, troops, capabilities, weapon systems, and so on, closer to Russia's border, this will automatically vindicate once more and once again their force posture, and therefore justify a certain number of hostile behavior that we've seen from Russia, whether it is conventional affairs, but also subconventional, sub-threshold activities, what we commonly call hybrid activities, basically everything that falls below Article 5 of collective defense. All these things will lead to further escalation and miscalculation, and therefore create a sort of endless spinning circle or endless circle of misunderstanding between both interests. So this is also not necessarily advisable to do so. So it is necessary now, I think, moving forward, to fine-tune exactly what is the role and place of the alliance, but also its individual members, as once again, as seen from Moscow, everybody else but Russia and the Arctic is now NATO territory.
Becca, how has this changed the discussion in the region? I mean, we were talking about melting permafrost and emerging sea routes and fishing rights and things of that nature. Has the whole discussion of security been amped up as a result of what's happened in Ukraine?
The security discussion has definitely been amped up, and we see Sweden and Finland moving towards NATO membership with just remarkable speed. But I think, and I'd obviously be interested in the panel's thoughts as well, but to my mind, the economic development trajectory of the Arctic is on ice. I hate to use that pun, but Russia was really moving ahead rapidly to develop its Arctic resources. And the war has led to unprecedented sanctions, which are continuing to bite hard. And so far, we have seen China, to a large part, comply with those sanctions. Last year, no Chinese ships went through Russia's Northern Sea route, hardly any foreign traffic, which is a major shift. It's a major blow to Russia. And a lot of the capital for developing the major projects along Russia's Arctic coast has dried up. And at the same time, in addition to foreign capital drying up, we're seeing Russian spending also be affected by its needs to support the war. So the state itself has less available capital to feed into the high north and the Arctic region. And we've seen a lot of churn in energy markets. So I think the economic prospects for Russia's Arctic development are much dimmer than they were a couple of years ago. That has changed the discussion. And I think we're increasingly just seeing a bifurcation between the Arctic Seven, who are all NATO allies or soon to be allies, and then Russia. And that will likely, again, I'd be interested in your thoughts, but to me, it seems like this will be the situation for a generation. I don't see any rapid change coming up. And, you two obviously watch Russia closely, so I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think that's right. This is a generational issue. This is not something that's going to go away quickly. It's not something that is going to resolve itself quickly. Any small level of trust that existed between Russia and NATO previously is gone. And I think I think honestly that is a good thing right now. I don't think that, again, Russia negotiates in good faith. I don't think that they are willing to cooperate in ways that we would understand as being productive, that is, we in the West would understand as being productive, mutually productive. So this is a bit of a zero-sum game, I think, that Russia is trying to play, and this is going to be something that lasts for quite a while. With regard to Russia's economic interests, I completely agree with Becca on this. There's no indication that the development of the Arctic is going to proceed as quickly in the future as it has in the past. Now, that I may be wrong about that, but there's just simply no indications about that, because the war in Ukraine has just so completely sucked in Russia's sort of economic and warfighting and intellectual sort of capacity that it's difficult to sort of move out on other fronts.
What can you tell us about relative capabilities of, not to oversimplify, both sides in the region, whether it be bases, whether it be ice cutters, whatever might be needed in competition or in conflict? What do we know about the relative capabilities?
Yeah, I start on the capabilities. So, well, in a nutshell, contrary to Ukraine, where it is really much about land warfare and building trenches and fighting there, the Arctic will actually be the opposite. It'll fundamentally be a mix of naval and air operations, and this is where Russia actually where the capabilities have been left largely untouched by the war against Ukraine, the second invasion of Ukraine. Air capabilities mostly, naval as well, because this is not a naval war in Ukraine, or very little naval components. And we know that some of the land components, the Arctic Brigade, have actually been fighting in Ukraine. Some of them have been decimated with a very poor track record of results. So the land component has been affected, yes, but the rest, in terms of capabilities, when it comes to the air, when it comes to naval platforms, have been left untouched, or relatively untouched. When it comes to bases and so on, I'd just like to recall the landscape and geography, because we tend to focus on the high north, basically what we see in Europe, or from a sort of European point of view. And coming from Europe, this is generally where I place the map on. But Russia sees it as a very long stretch from, of course, the gate of the Kara Sea in Europe to the North Pole approaches along the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. up to the Bering Strait on the other side of the world. And this is where you have Alaska as a target for Russia. So geography being what it is, Russia has been rebuilding a different network of bases, airstrips, landing pads, and so on, to make sure it can actually operate in the region, whether it is for the Northern Sea Route for civilian operations and cargo that Becca mentioned, but also for the military in terms of access, in terms of escorts through nuclear icebreakers, civilian nuclear icebreakers. And this network is aging. This network is not very sound from an infrastructural point of view. And I also have personal doubts that they're actually able to operate year-round for a lot of the bases they've been showing in terms of great power propaganda as well. It was always displayed as, look, we can operate in the region, we're doing great stuff, we're fighting the environment, we're fighting the cold. But I actually doubt that on the ground it's actually going as well as planned in terms of their coverage of their own network of bases. But it would be great to have Mike's assessment on that as well.
The only thing I'd say quickly is just that this point about geography that Matthew makes is a really good one. The other thing I'd add about geography is that it's often the case that geography is posed as a problem for Russia, and it's true. You know, Russia's bases in the Arctic along the Kola Peninsula are quite remote. On the other hand, that cuts both ways. It can be difficult to access the Barents Sea, even with a network of partners and allies that NATO currently has right now. Partner and ally bases in the high north in Norway and soon to be in Sweden and Finland are at risk because of their proximity to Russia. So that places a tremendous, that geography places a tremendous logistics load on countries like the United States and the UK, who have to project power forward and support forces that are going to be forward underneath those, that umbrella of capabilities that Russia can project out from the Kola Peninsula. So that geography cuts both ways.
At the risk of sounding sensationalistic, and that's not my intent, if there were to be a conflict in the high north, what would it look like? What would be the likely source of conflict, and how would it play out?
Well, the source of conflict could be anybody's guess. I agree with Matthew that if there is a conflict, it's likely to start somewhere else and bleed over into the Arctic. The Russians don't necessarily think about fighting a regional war just in the Black Sea or just in the Baltic Sea or just in the Arctic. It would be across a theater of military operations or multiple theaters of military operations. In terms of what that conflict looks like, my great fear is that the land-based facilities in the high north, are NATO land-based facilities in Norway, and again, soon to be in Sweden and Finland, are at risk because they're fixed. And Russia, if they have proven anything in the war in Ukraine and the war in Syria and in previous conflicts, is that they are very good at hitting fixed targets, and they can do that continuously. So those targets are going to be at risk, and what we may see is this idea that Russia, in the initial period of war, the early period of war, where Russia will ramp up its combat operations very, very quickly, will attempt to clear that space out and sort of create that geographical problem that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, that forces NATO and the United States to bear the logistics burden of pushing forces farther north. And then from there, very, very quickly, I think that allows them the space to usher in a theater campaign with their long-range precision strike capabilities. Now we know, based on the evidence of the Ukraine war, that some of those capabilities, not all, but some of those capabilities have been problematic. It appears that Russia has been fixing some of the sort of precision guidance issues that they've had. But many other capabilities that they've had, particularly those that are resident in the Navy, have been quite successful and have been the backbone of this sort of campaign against strategic infrastructure in Ukraine. And I think that's what it would look like in the high north and reaching down into the Norwegian Sea as well. So places like Keflavik in Iceland and the northern UK and coastal bases in Norway, perhaps even in Sweden and Finland as well, will also be at risk for that long-range theater campaign. So then it's up to NATO to push forces north. And, you know, how do we do that? Well, we're either going to do that with long-range strike capabilities that are resident in the United States or the carrier-based aircraft. Something needs to go up there and help open up that space again. And I think that's going to be the contest.
Well, what I want to ask each of you is to look ahead with us. You know, one of the things we pride ourselves in at the Wilson Center is being focused on trend lines and not just headlines. And the headlines are pretty difficult these days. And you've agreed that we're into a circumstance that will be generational. So as you look ahead, when you think in terms of investment, whether it be private sector or government investment, or you think of public policy initiatives or, that focus on the region, what should we be anticipating? How do you see things trending? And we can go, let's just go in this order. Mike, we'll start with you.
Sure. I am concerned honestly about stasis in the Arctic and negative stasis right now. As I mentioned before, I think that this is a generational problem that the Russians have created for themselves. This is the sort of thing where we may try to leave the door open for negotiations, also understanding, as I keep saying, that the Russians are not going to negotiate in good faith. It's possible to leave that door open, but I'm not convinced that even if the Russians decide to walk through, that they would do so in a mutually productive way. So I'm really concerned about stasis going forward, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. Russia needs the Ukraine problem to go away. It needs the Ukraine problem to go away one way or the other so it can move forward on its other initiatives in the Arctic, probably with Chinese help. The last thing I'll say in terms of trends is this Russia-China relationship bears very close watching, especially in the Arctic, as I think that China they've been pretty restrained with their relationship with Russia so far, but they are in a position to put Moscow over a barrel if they want to. In exchange for all of the economic and military relief that they can provide, they may try to leverage that for access. They may try to leverage that for undersea warfare technology, something the Russians are very, very good at. So those are the sort of trends that I think bear watching, at least here in the next 5 to 10 years.
Terrific. Thank you. Matt?
So to amplify what Mike said, completely agree with Russia-China. I think this is one of the key trends. Russia needs China more than China needs Russia to access the Arctic. There really is a question of dependency, and Russia is on the losing end of it. Another interesting trend is the impact of climate change, and Russia, because of geography, because of the size of the Arctic, we know that the most of the Arctic that will be first impacted by climate change when it comes to rapid changes that we can already see will be the Russian territory. It won't be the Canadian Arctic, it will be less so Alaska, it will definitely be the Russian Arctic. Therefore, this is a key issue for the Kremlin. What little investment they can salvage for Arctic development, they will need to actually spend an earmark for the mitigation of the impact of climate change when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to economic developments, when it comes to the basic livelihoods of those population in the Arctic. God knows that the Kremlin doesn't really care about its population in the first place, but this will definitely be a trend to follow. And then the last one, which is a little less about Russia, but more about the way the Arctic is going, is the place of technology. Modern technology in a changing Arctic. We will fundamentally have to rethink the way we approach man-made presence instead of being present from a sort of human perspective. What can technology do to help us in terms of remote access, in terms of more drones, for instance, in terms of more space ground coverage? And this is also where NATO and the alliance in general and its allies have a technological edge to sort of win that future technology battle that will define a lot of the rest of the world, not just the Arctic. So what is in the Arctic never really stays there.
Thank you. Rebecca, in addition to thanking you for sharing your brilliant guests with our now viewers today, I want to give you the final word. And I don't know if you want to thank me or blame me for that, but it's all yours.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Mike, and thank you, Matt. Hopefully this discussion has teed up a few of the many points of interest that we'll be exploring later this afternoon, and please visit the Polar Institute's website to find out more. But I think the takeaway is that the Arctic is a region where the US and its allies needs to be focused, needs to pay attention, because it is of tremendous importance to Russia, to China, our two competitors, and that's not going to be going away anytime soon. So we have a decadal problem, and it will take some close attention and some really careful analysis given all the complex issues that we've been discussing today. Thanks.
Rebecca Pincus, Mathieu Boulegue, and Michael Petersen, thank you Thank you very much for joining us today. I should also tell our viewers that the event that we keep referencing that will be coming up later today for our guests, but for you will be in the rearview mirror through the magic of time travel, is called Deterring Russia at Sea in the High North. You can find that by going to the Polar Institute events page on the Wilson Center website. We hope you enjoyed this discussion and this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.